Hi, good evening, and welcome everyone. We're so pleased to welcome Nathaniel Deutsch and Michael Casper. On behalf of the American Jewish Historical Society, we're hosting this book talk this evening to talk about their new book, A Fortress in Brooklyn: Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg. Joining us to lead the discussion is Shira Hanau, staff writer at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and I'll hand it over now to Shira.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to talk about this book. Hold it up. I'll feel like a late night host on Zoom, A Fortress in Brooklyn. This book was fascinating. I'm just going to give a short intro and then hand it over to Michael and Nathaniel to talk a little bit more about it. But we're going to be talking about Williamsburg, which is a community in Brooklyn that is one of three of the major Hasidic neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And in some ways, it's really the most interesting because of exactly what's talked about in this book, the specific housing circumstances that the community deals with, and the history involved with that. The community is dominated by the Satmar Hasidic community, which is one of the more fiercely anti-Zionist and one of the more strict in a host of other ways as well. And the community sort of started out there in the post-World War II era, sort of taking the place of, in some ways, or starting to take the place of a Jewish community that existed there, that sort of started to seep away as the Hasidic community became more entrenched and as white New Yorkers started to leave the city in general. And it's now extremely entrenched in the neighborhood, but also threatened by the same forces that the community is kind of implicated in. There's Hasidim who are part of the gentrifier group, and there's developing the buildings that are sort of forcing some of the lower income residents out. And then there are Hasidim on the other side who are threatened by that exact same phenomenon. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael and Nathaniel to tell us a little bit more about the book, and then I will ask them some more questions. And if you've got questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all of them.
Well, first I want to thank Rebecca Miller of the American Jewish Historical Society for organizing this, and Shira for moderating it. It's a great pleasure to be here. So as Shira's mentioned, our book focuses on a community of Hasidim, so Eastern European Jewish pietists, that's what the word Hasid means, pietists, who come from what we describe in the book as Greater Hungary. So what's now Hungary, Romania, even parts of Slovakia and Ukraine, who arrive in New York City and in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is right over the Williamsburg Bridge from the Lower East Side, in the mid and late 40s and into the 50s. And most of them are Holocaust survivors. Many of them have been in ghettos, in concentration camps. Many of them have lost their first families and are really recreating, on the one hand, recreating or trying to recreate the communities that were destroyed during the Holocaust, but at the same time, and this is something that Michael and I really emphasize in the book, creating something new in the United States, and something that ultimately is going to be very American, even as Hasidim in general emphasize how much they want to continue tradition. And they're doing that at a time when, as Shira noted, the neighborhood is going through a lot of changes in Brooklyn and New York City, and many cities around the country are going through changes in terms of white flight, in terms of divestment of city services, in terms of the growth of public housing, but also the racialization of public housing. And all sorts of changes that are going to transform the urban landscape, and a neighborhood like Williamsburg in particular. And the Hasidim are going to not only survive in the neighborhood in this time, but also thrive until gentrification arrives. And so our book has that arc, historically speaking. It goes from when the community is founded up to the present day, and the impacts of gentrification. And as you mentioned, Shira, the way in which Hasidim are both affected by it, but also implicated in gentrification.
Michael, do you want to add anything before I ask?
I would just add that our main questions were sort of, how and why Hasidim remained in the neighborhood over that long arc. and, against all odds, really. And so one of the main comparisons we make is to kind of other Jews who did leave, and yet who maybe had some connections to Williamsburg and continued this dialogue about what was happening there over the decades.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, is that because we're focusing on the post-war period and on Jews who remained very committed to religious tradition, and actually Jews who prior to World War II, in many cases, refused to come to the United States because they viewed it as a treif in the Medina, as an impure land. What we're really also trying to do is revise the standard view of American Jewish history, at least in the 20th century, which has tended to focus understandably on those giant waves of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who come from the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They also came from the Ottoman Empire, and who in many cases, may have started out religious, but then ceased to be very religious when they come to the US and assimilate into American society more generally. Our emphasis is on this other wave, smaller initially, but then because of the fertility rate and so on, becomes larger and larger and larger. And then going forwards into the future, I think is going to have a very big impact on the American Jewish future, in the same way that they are, in Israel, for example.
Great. So I was wondering, as I was reading this book, I wanted to know what drew you to this topic. I want to start there. What made you want to write this book? How did you come to this story that involves public housing and real estate deals and artists and Hasidim in Williamsburg?
So the book really began when Nathaniel and I were both living near Williamsburg over 10 years ago. And, separately, it turned out, had been spending time in the Hasidic community. We had made contacts there. I, speaking for myself, really loved to walk around there and buy a Yiddish newspaper and speak a little Yiddish, which I had studied. And when Nathaniel and I met, this was around 2007, 8, 9. It was also at the time of the crash, huge wave of foreclosures in and around Williamsburg. Some of those zip codes had the highest rate of foreclosures in the city. And that whole neighborhood went through massive transformation, which we watched basically in real time. And so, I think we both had sort of separate interests in various aspects of the neighborhood, the religious aspects, the social dynamics, and gentrification, and how the Hasidim themselves were expanding into other neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy really interested us.
So for me, I had lived in Williamsburg since the 1990s, but in the hipster part of Williamsburg, a few blocks away from the Hasidic part. So Williamsburg has different parts, like a traditionally Italian part in East Williamsburg, Hasidic part in South Williamsburg that also has a number of Latino and African-American residents, especially in the housing projects, and then a more kind of historically Slavic and other white ethnic neighborhood in the north side of Williamsburg. That was the first part that became gentrified and became kind of associated or known as hipster Williamsburg. And I was living there, and a couple of things got me interested in doing some kind of research in the Hasidic part. One was that I became friends with a Hasidic community member, and he and I would learn together in a shtibel, in a small synagogue that actually became like part of an epicenter for those Hasidim who really ended up opposing gentrification, which we write about extensively in a chapter called the War Against the Artists. That was one thing. And he used to take me around to different places in the neighborhood and introduce me to people. And the second thing was that when my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, Tamar, she had a midwife who was in the Hasidic part of the neighborhood who had delivered 3,000 babies to Hasidic women, including one woman who had 17 babies whom she delivered. And so that was another kind of entree and made me curious about a totally different aspect of the community.
Great. So jumping off of that, I wanted to know, as a reporter who reports on the Orthodox Jewish community, I know that getting access into those communities can be very difficult. And I wanted to hear about, how did you do the research on this book, and especially the interviews? Like, how did you make those relationships and get people to trust you and to speak candidly about that? And I also wanted to ask about the gender piece. You dealt with gender, I felt like, in a way that, sometimes people don't. I thought that it was very, very well done. And it was clear that you had spoken to women, and I wanted to hear about that too. As two male authors, how did you make sure to get entree into both halves of that community?
Well, we did different kinds of interviews. We did sort of man on the street interviews, and interviewing anybody, Hasidic or not. Some people were willing to answer, some not. Some women answered, some didn't. We also interviewed some major Hasidic real estate developers, and we came to them in different ways. But through contacts. In one case, through a Hasidic contact. In another case, my friend's brother happened to live in a building that was developed by someone we were already writing about and interested in. And so that really, so that's how we got access. But, I found that people spoke candidly to us about the community once, or any of our questions that we had.
So, to some extent, Michael and I did some interviews together. In some cases, we did it separately. In the case of, a number of the women that I interviewed, some of them I met through male relatives, and others I just met independently. There were some differences, I would say, in terms of like where the interviews would take place. So, for example, like with the men, I mentioned that I would learn with somebody, and that's just something that I do in general. So learning was a way, like an entree into the male, and it's a very gender segregated community, as I'm sure a lot of people, in this audience here, and you are aware. When it came to women, most of the interviews I conducted were in people's homes, or in, let's say, like a coffee shop outside of Williamsburg, outside of Hasidic Williamsburg. Could be in like the north side, or even more typically, let's say, in Manhattan, lower Manhattan. Just because it was proximate, it's pretty close to Williamsburg. But people, like Michael said, like people actually were very willing to talk. In general, they were kind of curious about us sometimes. One time we were near this development, this big housing development, and somebody came up to us because we were just kind of looking around. They're like, are you guys, what are you guys doing here? Are you guys related? They thought I was his father, and which is, I think, technically possible. I mean, age-wise, and because they were just, that was a thing that I found a lot personally, was people would often ask, like, okay, what's your family name? Where do they come from? And what's your family status? Like, are you married? Do you have kids? Those kinds of things. And to kind of, it's interesting always when you interview people to also see how they're situating you and what they're thinking of you, because obviously we're all human beings. We all are thinking about one another. So, and that was important too, to see not just what we thought of them, but also, what they, at least, obviously, we're also thinking things that they weren't telling us, but what some of the things they were curious about us.
Right. I'm curious about what they were asking you about. What did they think that you thought about them?
That we thought about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, did they say anything to you about how they thought the book would be perceived, or what happens if you write about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so one interesting case was with this major Hasidic real estate developer, and he was kind of like, well, who's going to read this book? Who would be interested in this? And I think that might have helped him be more candid with us than might have. I mean, this is not, going to be a stocking stuffer by any stretch, but I think.
Don't say that, Michael.
Sorry. Okay, yeah, I misspoke. Yeah. So, but people were generally curious and sort of supportive in their own way, I think.
Yeah, I, I- it was, I think the question of like whether people in the community would read it. I mean, that was one that has come up a number of times where some people saying like, oh, most people, they're not going to read it. And then others saying, well, I know certain people that will be interested in reading it. Some of it is the language issue too, is, to what extent, because it's also written, we try to make it engaging, but, it's still, a book that for some, could be challenging if English isn't their native language, or they don't spend a lot of time reading and so on. But one thing that I thought was interesting was from some of the people who have read it in the community that we've spoken with since, that seeing the big picture for them has been interesting, because they experience some of what we've written about, and yet we try to put it, as historians do, into a big picture. And I think for anyone in any community to have someone write about the community from the outside, suddenly you see your own community with the different eyes, and that's been gratifying for us to have that kind of feedback.
Something that I was struck by when I was reading the book was the depth with which, or the clarity with which you described the differences in how Hasidim often view Jews who are not Orthodox and non-Jews. That sometimes the relationships come more easily with non-Jews than with Jews who are not Orthodox. And I wanted to see if you could say a little bit more about that, especially because, in light of COVID and some of the complicated relationships that other Jews in New York have had to sort of seeing Hasidic communities that have maybe responded to the pandemic differently. That's something that I've heard from people a lot, just a lot of confusion. Why do we feel like such different communities? So I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about those relationships and what you observed.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. It's interesting, there have been people who have written about Hasidic Williamsburg basically from the beginning, or almost the beginning, from like the 1950s on. And one of the things that they noted, and actually one of the things that you mentioned, that there was an earlier Jewish community in Williamsburg. It was one of the largest Jewish communities in New York City, and it was known as the most Orthodox Jewish community. Already in the 1920s and 1930s. That was one of the reasons actually that the Hasidim were initially attracted to it. And yet, even though, or maybe even arguably because they were Orthodox, but not Hasidic, or even not Hasidic in the particular Hungarian way of being Hasidic, which is distinctive even among other Hasidim, there was tension, and the Hasidic groups, Satmar being the biggest one that arrived in the 40s and 50s, were very concerned that their followers would be influenced by the local Jews even more than non-Jews, because the other Jews represented a different Jewish path. And they could, the Hasidim could look to the non-Jews and say, oh, you don't want to be like them. Of course you don't want to be like them. They're non-Jews, right? But if you see other Jews, especially Orthodox Jews, let's say many Orthodox Jews in those days, were, they didn't, even now, of course, some don't have beards. They were very Americanized in a lot of ways. Even when it came to like eating out and things like that, they might not follow the same kind of customs that Orthodox Jews would now. And so there was a sense that, and they said, we're Orthodox and we're American. And the Hasidim were like, we want to distance our community from them. And you would see like accounts where it'd say children would call other Jews, including Orthodox Jews, shkutzim, which is a pejorative term for non-Jews. And these were other Jews. So there has been that tension. At the same time, as you mentioned, the Satmar became very notorious for being anti-Zionist, profoundly anti-Zionist, at a time when Zionism was increasing in popularity among American Jews. So they were distanced from the other Jews in the US in that regard too. So there's a variety of reasons why they end up becoming distanced. And they see it as a way of protecting themselves and their community from negative influences. And ironically or not, the most negative influences arguably were from other Jews in their mind, not from non-Jews.
And I wonder if you could also catch us up to the present day in that regard. You write about how sort of the external danger to the community kind of changes over time from the other Jews in the neighborhood who are not Satmar to being the artisten, the hipsters. And so how does that happen? And then, you know, coming to the present day, we were talking right before we started about the health craze that's kind of taken hold of many Hasidic communities and sort of the adoption of certain norms that maybe would have seemed like the threatening aspects of hipster culture. So I wonder if you can catch us up. What's the outsider threat in Williamsburg today?
Well, I think the hipster threat is kind of in the past too, interestingly. But but yeah, I mean, for many decades, Hasidim lived mostly, you know, with Latino and African American neighbors. And when, you know, these are, you know, at first artists, later maybe college graduates, not artists, but other, you know, young gentrifiers started to move to the area. You know, not all of them white, but many of them. The Hasidim, similarly to the way they saw other non-Orthodox Jews in an earlier period as, you know, a potential threat for their children in particular, to see they could possibly become these, you know, these tattooed people with dogs who, you know, laugh loudly in the street. These are some of the examples of things that Hasidim had told us and wrote about in Der Yid and others, you know, newspapers about why they, you know, the kind of low character that they thought these their new neighbors had, and so it was a question of modesty too in a lot of cases, and they would write about especially how women would dress in the neighborhood, which was a kind of a threat to the general modest character that they tried to keep.
Yeah, and one of the things that's also important to keep in mind is that the gentrification of Williamsburg occurred at the same time as other changes that were impacting the Hasidic community in the neighborhood, as well as Haredim. So Hasidim are kind of a branch or a subgroup within the broader Haredi, or sometimes it's called in English, ultra-Orthodox, you know, category of Jews. And that was things like the internet and the exposure to all sorts of different influences and luxury goods and things that previously were not available to Hasidim in a place like Williamsburg, as well as the general embourgeoisement of the community, so that they were certain segment of the community in particular became wealthier. And if you look at Hasidic media, and there's a lot of Hasidic media, this is something that's perhaps not appreciated by people who aren't in the community or study it, is that you have a lot of magazines, you have newspapers. It also proliferates in this time. You have online stuff. You start to see ads for things like vacations in Switzerland, or spend Pesach in Miami, or you know, foods, you know, that are photographed in these really, you know, like you know, food magazine ways. And Michael especially has studied this phenomenon that, and we write about it too in the book, that in the 1950s and on, the Satmar in particular had this ideology of being opposed to luxus, luxury. They're very kind of ascetic as a kind of ideal, and the Satmar Rebbe, their leader in particular, tried to live out that ideal, and yet you see over time this weakening of that opposition, at least in some camps within Hasidic Williamsburg, and then you also see a resistance to it. So that's something that is, I think, characterizes the recent years, which is some people being attracted to the things that, let's say, gentrification represents, and then other people adamantly resisting it and invoking the past to say, look at the way we used to be, and now we've declined since then, and we have to try to restore what, you know, our glorious past in the 50s and 60s and so
on. So in the gentrification direction, I wanted to ask about how that relates to race, because conversations about gentrification generally are related to race. And we know that for the last several years, there's been a conversation that I think has been happening mostly not in the Hasidic community, but has really taken hold in the Jewish community about are Jews white? Do Jews count as white given their history of persecution, of being a minority, of being oppressed in various places that they lived in? Do they count as white in America? And I wanted to know, when you were doing this research, did you ask people, do you consider yourself white? Like, what is the Hasidic view of that question? And especially given the past, not the last 4 years anymore, but during the Trump presidency, how did that come up when you spoke to people about whiteness and gentrification?
I mean, that's a really excellent and complicated, I would say, set of questions, because first I would say that, of course, there are Jews who are, there are African-American Jews, there are Asian American Jews, there are Jews from the Middle East, there are Jews who, either don't identify as white or aren't identified as white by others, and in a different kind of way than let's say Ashkenazi, or even more specifically Eastern European Jews. Even there, though, the question of to what extent they are white or have been white, or are white in certain ways and not in others, is very complicated, and is kind of unstable too, in the sense that you can have, and this is obviously a bigger conversation, but on the one hand, Ashkenazi Jews are described as decidedly non-white by a lot of white supremacists, but then also will enjoy what's now called white privilege in a whole variety of ways. So, and then, of course, they were treated as non-white during the Holocaust and murdered for that. So it's very, I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that. I guess what we've tried to do in our book is to provide one lens to that bigger question that you're raising, which is, what does the experience of Hasidim do or offer to that question? And I do think it brings up some differences, because, if we think about race as being constructed, and many factors going into it, including, social construction and the way people imagine other people and so on, and the way people are treated and what they experience. Hasidim in Williamsburg, something we argue very strongly in our book, their experience, especially in the 50s on, is until really gentrification especially, is much more similar to their African American, and for most of that history Puerto Rican, then there are other kinds of Latinos move in, but neighbors than it is to let's say Ashkenazi or Eastern European or German other Jews, Ashkenazi Jews living, or for that matter Sephardi Jews, let's say, living in the suburbs, right, in that same period. What do I mean? Or they live in public housing projects at a time when whites are leaving public housing projects in New York City and elsewhere in droves. And that's exactly when they move into these high-rise public housing projects. And almost all of their other neighbors in those projects are African Americans and Latinos. During the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, Hasidim, but not other Jews in New York City, even though there's a lot of poor Jews in New York City in the 60s and 70s, Hasidim distinguished themselves for tapping into those government anti-poverty programs, different kinds of aid to mothers with dependent children, a whole bunch of things. They even, at a certain point under Reagan, are officially designated as a disadvantaged minority group by a government agency, and therefore gain benefits for that. So there's a whole variety of ways in which, and during the same period, they experienced the divestment of city services that happened to neighborhoods like Williamsburg. They also suffer from environmental pollution that has a strong racial and racist dimension in areas like Williamsburg, in terms of putting things like incinerators there and so on. So in those ways, are they African American? Are they not white? Well, this is kind of like a complicated way of getting at, or a particular way of getting at that question. They experience a lot of the things that these definitely non-white groups experience. Now, whether they see themselves as white or not, they definitely, in my, in terms of some of the people that we interviewed and that I interviewed personally, I did ask that very explicitly recently to somebody, a Hasidic I know, and he said, he kind of said, I can't remember exactly what he said, but that's not exactly the right question in the sense that for him, it's much more important the Jewish versus non-Jewish distinction and the Hasidic versus non-Hasidic distinction. I think that, the answer is probably like both and. In some ways, yes. In some ways, not exactly. Like, does he see himself as white in the same way that other or that white people who definitely would, if you ask them, they say, yeah, of course I'm white. I would say no, but I would say this, like in recent years, I think that one of the things that I find interesting about the rightward shift politically among a lot of Hasidim is I wonder to what extent that will also ultimately involve a kind of greater identification with a kind of white identity than previously existed. I'll leave that as kind of like an open question, but I wonder whether that may even be happening now as a result of like supporting Trump in great numbers and so on.
Yeah, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about the support for Trump too. You mentioned that the community really spans the gamut of just so many of income, of dependence on welfare, of dependence on public housing, especially as you've got, on the one side, you've got the developers that really do have wealth. And on the other side, you've got the people who are searching for affordable housing and often failing. So how do you make sense of how this community that has such a large range of income, how does it all fit into this umbrella of support for Trump in a community that really overwhelmingly voted for Trump in the last election?
Well, I think there's always been wealth inequality within the Hasidic community, and that was certainly exacerbated by the economic crash in 2008 and the subsequent, rise of a class of extremely wealthy Hasidic real estate developers. Because at that time, a lot of the major developers in the city pulled out of their holdings in Brooklyn. And that's precisely when Hasidic developers got in, because they had such an attachment to the neighborhood. It was so close, there was already a housing shortage. Anyway, that's some of the background that contributed to that. And so there have always been, I think, wealthy Hasidim and many more working class Hasidim, many of whom use the Section 8 housing voucher or live in public housing. I don't think that I don't know how much cognitive dissonance there is among Hasidim who, let's say, use Section 8 and, also vote for maybe Republicans who would be ideologically opposed to welfare. I think that Hasidim vote really pragmatically, especially in local elections, and so they'll vote for Republicans or Democrats. And even though there was a large swing towards Trump, there were some prominent Hasidic community members who supported, Clinton, for example. Nathaniel.
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything you've said. I guess I would have one caveat, which is that I wonder whether now, though, in this current moment, we're seeing a shift away among some, at least, away from that pragmatism, which has typically characterized Hasidic voting in Brooklyn. It's been profoundly pragmatic, and as you say, often very interested in certain and bread and butter issues, like when it comes to education, when it comes to housing, and so on. What can these candidates do for our community, and so on. To some extent, you could see that in the support for Trump, insofar as he gave gestures towards, support for private schools and that sort of thing. But there's also, to me, I think, I don't know, for the first time, but certainly in this kind of extreme way, a stronger ideological component, as well as a kind of, in talking to some of the people that I spoke with, a kind of almost personal affinity. And one thing that I heard from a number of people is this idea that, well, Trump is the first candidate, at least at that level, who recognizes it, who sees us as a community. There was a sense of like, wow, someone finally sees us, and I don't think that it's negating the pragmatic, definitely. And you see, for example, in the current mayoral race in New York City, like the pragmatic concerns are coming up, a lot. But I do wonder if it isn't like a window onto maybe, this kind of, especially in the national level, right? Because in a certain way, where Hasidim live in such great numbers, over 90% live in the Northeast, in states where their vote in a national election doesn't really matter in terms of tipping it, they can then vote for other reasons beyond the pragmatic. And the fact that so many of them voted for Trump, including compared between 2016 and 2020, it increased a lot between those two. In some areas, Hasidic areas, it was over 90% voted for Trump. That suggests that there may be other things beyond pragmatism at play for at least some of the people there, I would say.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say any more about that. You mentioned a bit in the book, sort of the Hasidic concept of masculinity, which is something that I've always found really fascinating, and sort of how the hipster notions of that was sort of a foil to the Hasidic concept of masculinity. And I wonder if you could describe sort of those two visions. And I wonder if Trump can fit into that, if you've analyzed that.
Well, Nathaniel, wasn't there a gendered kind of component to how Hasidim voted in 2016? I thought, yeah.
You know what? That was a question that I thought was really important to try to figure out. And I did talk to some Hasidic women I knew about that. And I don't think at least as far as I know, no one has been able to kind of answer that question, whether in 2016 there was, in other words, like, did Hasidic men and women vote differently in terms of their support for Trump, or did that happen in 2020? But I think that is an excellent question. And it is connected, I think, to some extent, Shira, to your question regarding Hasidic masculinity. That is to say, in a really gender segregated community, you would expect perhaps there to be differences that might be reflected, in voting. If the experiences are really different, if the relationship to politics is different generally, might that also be expressed that way? And I would say that that's, given that it's 50% of the population, it's really important to try to figure that out. But in terms of the masculinity, one thing that we encountered, in talking to different people, was the sense of a kind of positive view of what some people thought was a previous generations of men's kind of like gruff, no nonsense, not interested in like fancy food at weddings, and just kind of working hard, and maybe perceived as rude by other people, but that was not just like a matter of manners, but was also perceived as a kind of masculinity that was seen as authentic and reflected a genuineness that some people felt, and also at times a willingness to engage in physical violence or force if members of the community were threatened, or if the kind of community's boundaries were threatened, versus a sense among some that the current generation was not as tough as that generation, and was relatively speaking, let's say, more coddled, whether that was a reflection of the influence of gentrification or more the embourgeoisement, the general, which gentrification was connected to, is a good question. Michael, actually, one of the ways we met was that I was interested in some work he was doing on a Hasidic softball team in McCarran Park, in the border between Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, that was a short-lived team that played in I think the Greenpoint softball league. So it was all kinds of different teams, and they were called the Stormers. And about half the team was Hasidic, I think, and then the rest were Puerto Rican and Dominican coworkers of the Hasidim, who you usually could barely field a team, and yeah, so that was a kind of. But what was important about it was that it happened outside of the Hasidic community. I mean, outside of Hasidic Williamsburg, far enough outside that probably no family members or anyone they know would go by, at least at that time. And yeah, it was facilitated by the proximity of the fact that there was a softball league. There's a housing project named after Roberto Clemente in basically Hasidic Williamsburg. Hasidim and Puerto Ricans live there together, and there's a playground. And as far as I know, Hasidim do not play baseball there in that neighborhood where baseball is always played. But the fact that gentrification had brought this new area, they were still playing with Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, other people from around the neighborhood, but in this sort of neutral space. But they would all say that their parents would be upset or even hit them if they found out that they were playing baseball, that they should be studying. And so,
how old were the people participating in that team?
I'd say they were in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s.
That was fascinating. Anyone who's read The Chosen, you got to do a compare and contrast between the baseball chapter and
The What was interesting is some of them knew about The Chosen, or the film version. So yeah, I mean, that's something that we found in many of our interviews, and just in general, is that the Hasidim, respond to everything, and in their media, as Nathaniel said, there's a lot of Hasidic media. In the editorials, in the letters to the editor, which we tried to make a lot of use of in the book, they'll respond to what's written about them, in the press. Any issues in New York City is discussed, and the Der Yid, the main newspaper in Williamsburg, is hundreds of pages long, and so so in some ways it's not surprising that these Hasidim playing softball did know about The Chosen.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID and how that has changed things since since you were writing the bulk of the book and doing the research. There's been a million articles. If you get the New York Times in print, it feels like every week there's another article about everyone leaving for the suburbs. Leaving New York City, and now they're recalibrating. Maybe people are coming back to Brooklyn, maybe they're coming back to Manhattan. I'm wondering if you have a sense at this point of what does COVID do to the gentrification crisis, to the housing crisis in Williamsburg, or to other Hasidic communities where they're all kind of dealing with this issue of affordable housing, and where there's for a long time kind of been this exodus to satellite Orthodox communities that maybe have cheaper housing.
Yeah, so there's the broader issue of Hasidim leaving these communities, Borough Park, Crown Heights, Williamsburg, in large part because of, they have been for the last at least 10 years, because of lack of affordable housing. And as Michael mentioned, one section of our book, we look at the expansion of Hasidic Williamsburg into neighboring areas of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Clinton Hill. And that was due to just a complete lack of housing in Hasidic Williamsburg and the inability to expand into North Williamsburg, where the hipster part of Williamsburg, which was just way too expensive and they couldn't compete in the housing market there. And then once what's called New Williamsburg, that area in the parts of Bed-Stuy and Clinton Hill that they expanded into became saturated too, then that also encouraged people to just move out to Jersey City, to Kiryas Yol, to even other areas. Even though a lot of people obviously have remained. But what's interesting is that in some parts of Williamsburg, the people who have remained, there might be a family, some places, some units or apartments, or even brownstones might have an older couple living there. They might have had 10 kids, but then the kids move out, and then so some of the housing isn't being used, let's say, maximally. And those kids have families. Once they get married, they have to find a place to live. So then they're encouraged to leave. It's also become harder for Hasidim much harder to move into public housing in Williamsburg, and so that's also helped to encourage people to leave. I'm not sure whether COVID per se is having an impact. I mean, it's all it's Michael and I were talking about this right before. and it's happening in real time. So definitely anything we might say now is far from definitive. I'm not sure whether COVID is accelerating that in the same way that in the way that it has for other people, and in fact it might open up certain, for example, real estate possibilities, in terms of if prices go down. It's often the and it's not just Hasidim, there's one thing we look at in the book is these networks of people from a whole variety of communities, Hasidim, Syrian Jews, Russian Jews, Albanians, Italians, Caribbean Americans, a whole variety, individuals working together in the local Brooklyn real estate kind of ecosystem, as it were, and helping one another in different ways and competing with one another. And those are the people who are on the ground, and can, as Michael indicated, even with like the 2008-9 crash, who can then pivot quickly to kind of take advantage of opportunities in ways that people who are outside can't, even though in Williamsburg in recent years, there's been a lot of international big real estate money from like the Manhattan families, from investors from East Asia, the Netherlands, etc. So I don't know whether COVID will. I don't know, Michael. What do you think? Do you think it's going to affect that? Or
I mean, another question I have is how the eviction moratorium might have affected Hasidim and the real estate business. We're not. I haven't been obsessively reading the Yiddish press like I used to this year, but I'm sure it's being discussed, that there. And so, yeah, I'm sure that there is an effect. I don't know how that'll play out.
Oh yeah, they in the Yiddish press, the Hasidic press, they follow real estate issues really, really carefully. Any kind of major proposed legislation, developments that will affect the real estate industry.
I actually, I subscribe to the UJO, the mailing list of the United Jewish Organizations, which is one of the main community-based organization in Williamsburg. And just last week, they sent an email in Yiddish announcing, now everyone can know that about thousands of apartments or new Section 8 housing vouchers opening up in Brooklyn. So this is like major news. And so this is one way that they will get the word out. Section 8 is followed very closely.
Yeah, and there's Twitter feeds and things like that to not let people know that that Section 8, which can be very hard to get, is that there's opportunity to get it and so on. Yeah.
Right, which kind of makes it all the more interesting that so much of the Orthodox community in New York City has or the Hasidic community has coalesced around Andrew Yang, and rather than one of the more progressive candidates who might have been more interested in increasing public housing. I wonder if that surprised either of you.
Yeah, I mean, Yang. So and I talked to a bunch of people in recent days about this, and in different Hasidic communities, and everyone I talk to says that it's between Yang and Adams in terms of their support. Adams has a long-standing relationship with different Hasidic communities in Williamsburg, in Borough Park, in Crown Heights, and has cultivated it for a long time. There's also a long history going back at least to Shirley Chisholm, of African-American politicians in North Brooklyn having support from Hasidim. The Hasidim in Crown Heights supported her different candidacies very strongly, for example. And I think that, and then Yang came in as a kind of wild card, and he distinguished himself by basically saying, more or less unequivocally, that he was going to take a hands-off attitude towards education. And there's a big, for those of you who may not know, there's a big controversy right now as to whether Hasidic schools will be compelled to comply with state standards regarding the curriculum and secular subjects and so on. And for many Hasidim, that's a kind of third rail, because this founding Hasidic schools, and in fact, the Hasidic school, if you took all the students in the Hasidic schools, it would be the second largest public school not district, maybe it's just in the state of New York. It's bigger than Buffalo. Buffalo is the second after New York City. So it's a lot of students. It also provides a lot of jobs for people teaching in the schools. And of course, educating Hasidic children is key to, maybe the key to continuing, the traditions and reconstituting the community initially, and then recreating it with every generation. So I think that that's why he's gotten so much traction. The question of like, why aren't they supporting somebody who would be more progressive when it comes to public housing? It's a good question. In certain ways, it might be somewhat similar to like the whole "what's the matter with Kansas," argument, like that certain people appear to vote against their interests. But then I think we should also expand the notion of what interests are. It's not so simple. People have interests that may not be obvious to others. And I think that they might feel, this is the last thing I'll say about it, they might feel that, the threat to education is more immediate. And the likelihood that a New York City mayor will be able to deliver affordable housing when that's really done at the federal level is much slimmer and more distant. And so it's better to focus on the more immediate threat.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder that if anybody's got any questions, we're getting towards the end of our time, but if you want to stick those in the Q&A channel or the chat, we will try to get to those. So one last thing that I wanted to ask was, there's a lot of great stories in the books and really good jokes from the Satmar Rebbe, and some just really great characters, but I'm sure that there's things you had to leave out. So I'm wondering, if both of you want to just think, is there a story or something that didn't quite make it that you wish you could have gotten in there?
Well, we cut a lot. Yeah, I have to think of a good story though.
There were parts of things that we didn't, because we have long excerpts that we cite from Hasidic. We try to include a lot of different kinds of Hasidic sources, halachic sources. The Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoelish, he was a very prolific author in all sorts of different genres, and he also, as you said, he had a really kind of Black sense of humor and would tell all, and so his disciples would write down all sorts of jokes that he said in different contexts. So there were some jokes we left out, for example.
Yeah, we left out a lot of jokes. Yeah, I mean, because some of them, they were very hard to let go of, especially once you've found them, and some of these were repeated in Hebrew and Yiddish sources.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the jokes that we include that I think gives a sense of his sense of humor was he was driving through Crown Heights with his driver. He didn't drive himself, and they're going by, this was in the 50s or early 60s, and they go by a house or a bunch of houses with really beautiful Christmas lights, and the driver says, "Oh, this must be look at the non-Jews. I mean, use a different term look at their house." And then the Satmar Rebbe said, "How do you know they're non-Jews? What do you? I bet that they're Jews." And the driver says, "What do you mean they're Jews? They have Christmas lights." And he said, No. When Jews have Christmas lights, they make them the nicest lights possible. And so I know that these are Jewish. I knew that these are Jewish houses, and that speaks to his cynicism towards other Jews, but also the way in which he used humor in these kinds of situations, as well.
Michael, I want to give you the chance to deliver one of these jokes if you want to.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't know if it qualifies as a joke, but basically, people would come to him with these very serious questions, and he often replied with, as Nathaniel said, there's a little bit of a cynical remarks sometimes that had an aspect of wordplay. But yeah, one thing that just came to mind that I thought was clever is he was said to be passing a kosher butcher shop, and the sign said kosher, and it was flashing lights. And he said, sometimes it's kosher, sometimes it's not.
You had to be there.
I had to hear it in Yiddish, I'm sure.
Okay, that one was cut.
That one was cut.
We've got a couple of questions. I'm going to try and group a couple of them into one topic. So we've got a few questions about voting in the Hasidic community. And so one, there's a lot of questions about how do people know who to vote for? You know, if there's a block vote, how does the word get out? Who is directing that? And another great question about why, if Satmar Jews in particular are anti-Zionist, why they support Trump, who is so pro-Israel. So if you can answer both together, let's see how much we can get through.
I would just say quickly about, you know, voting for Trump while remaining anti-Zionist. I think that could be chalked up to the type of cognitive dissonance that we talked about earlier, but also that, you know, the anti-Zionism may be on the wane. And, you know, for example, Hasidic developers work very closely with Israeli investors and Israeli real estate brokers. And, you know, it's a far cry from the days when the Satmar Rebbe made, you know, anything connected to the state of Israel anathema. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's one of the biggest questions right now is to what extent is the anti-Zionism of community like Satmar, which has historically been so anti-Zionist, still as intense. And of course, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that like there are so many different opinions within the Hasidic community. You know, like any community, there's a wide range of opinions, and some are still super anti-Zionist, others though less so. I definitely think that there has been a lessening in terms of how people vote. It's rare for a Hasidic Rebbe to go and say, vote for so-and-so. They tend to be distant, you know, keep themselves in in order to preserve their kedusha, their holiness, and their kind of and a kind of distance from these kinds of mundane things. But then there are a couple of ways. One, newspapers, Hasidic media. There are also one of the things that we talk a lot about is the emergence of a class of activists, or askunim in Yiddish, who, among other things, are also involved in getting word out regarding who people should vote for. Ironically, in certain ways, it was looking like, you know, in recent years, it was looking like the kind of famously block voting habits of Hasidim was being undermined by developments like succession battles and the internet and other things that eroded that. And yet, at the same time, there was such strong support for Trump. So whether or not that's like an anomaly, you know, and in the future, it'll be less of the kind of block voting is a really good question, I think, that going forwards, you know, we can look at.
Yeah, especially now as there's been such a strong coalescing behind Ying as the sort of defender of yeshiva's candidate.
Yeah.
Great question. We got another question about how is the topic of Israel covered in local media? And especially because you spoke about and you wrote about some of the back and forth that would happen in these newspapers and like the letter writing, the editorials. What are the discussions like when it comes to Israel and local media?
In the Yiddish press, they typically excoriate Israel and its actions anonymously, typically. Even non-editorials are often anonymous, not always. There are staff writers at Der Yid and other journals. But also I found that they cover Israel in great detail, also in a kind of ambivalent way, you know, including developments in technology or military technology. And so when you read this, if you didn't know that they were anti-Zionist, you might think that they're covering this because they support Israel, you know, developments, you know, in military strategy and, you know, any way in which Israel's covered in the press, they'll also cover.
Yeah. In general, I mean, and they still have, you know, will have anti-Zionist, you know, kind of demonstrations slash, billboard things in Williamsburg, and there's Naturi Karta, which is not Satmar, which is a different group, which is still very that's a raison d'etre to be really anti-Zionist. But as Michael says, even the earliest, from the time that the Hasidim in Williamsburg acquired their yid, which had previously been owned by other people, it would cover a lot of local Israeli politics, all sorts of things about Israeli society politics, even as that was a period in which the Satmar Rebbe was describing Israel as Satan, literally the work of Satan. And so it didn't preclude, interest and coverage and so on. And he visited Israel too, I think 4 or 5 times himself. So they engage with it a lot.
That's a fascinating question. So I think that we will end with that one. I'm sorry for those we didn't get to, but thank you everyone for joining us. It was a pleasure. The book, as you can see here, oh, Rebecca, maybe you're going to say it, but I just want everyone to know the link in the chat and the code for a discount there. So check it out.